Well, first thing we have to understand is that this war was brought on by NATO expansion, plain up. In February of 2008, William Burns, who's currently the director of the CIA, back then he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memorandum called Niet means Niet, Russia's red lines on Ukraine. And he warned the President of the United States and everybody, all NATO partners, that Russia's red lines were serious, that if NATO were to invite Ukraine in, this would inevitably trigger a chain of events that would probably lead to Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, the loss of Crimea, the loss of the Donbass. This was known in 2008, and yet we invited Ukraine in, which means from a cause and effect analysis, we knew what we were getting into. We were warned by the U.S. ambassador to Russia that if you invite NATO, there will be a war, Russia will intervene, and Ukraine will be dismembered. And yet we did it anyways. Then we entered into this policy of the Great Reset under Obama, which was really just regime change to replace Putin with Medvedev. That didn't work. Putin stayed in. So then we sought to undermine Putin by promoting the Maidan coup that got rid of the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, replaced him with a government of our choosing that happened to be composed of radical right-wing nationalists who have links with Nazi Germany's ideology. And we've empowered them, the Azov Battalion. Don't believe me, believe the U.S. Congress, since from 2015 onwards, had an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which said no money can be used to support the Azov Battalion because it is a white supremacist neo-Nazi unit. If the U.S. Congress is recognized as such, I agree with them on this one. But we've empowered them. But even then, Russia sought to avoid war. You know, in 2014, there was a battle north of Donetsk in the Donbass where anti-Ukrainian forces, ethnic Russians, supported by the Russian government, we know that, they deny it, but we know it, surrounded 10 to 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers and were going to annihilate the Ukrainian army. That would have ended the fighting. The Ukrainian government went to the French and the Germans and begged their intervention, and they came in and they negotiated something called the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords were basically a ceasefire that would then turn into a permanent ceasefire that would respect the autonomy of ethnic Russians, so they could speak their language, study their, have their religion, etc., but keep the Donbass as part of Ukraine. Russia believed in this, signed it. Putin tried to implement this for 8 years. We now know, and what we've learned since Boris Johnson's intervention, Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, has come out and acknowledged it was a sham. We were never going to do Minsk. We only entered it to buy time so NATO could build a Ukrainian army that could conquer the Donbass through force of arms. So NATO builds an army that is going to, through force of arms, solve the situation that Minsk. Remember, Minsk isn't just an agreement between Ukraine, Germany, and France. It was taken to the Security Council of the United Nations, and there is a United Nations Security Council resolution saying this is international law, this is the will of the world. So Russia's believing this, but Ukraine's saying, no, that's all a lie. We're going to build an army to resolve this thing, which the Security Council says must be resolved peacefully. We're going to resolve it through force of arms. And now we found out from Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the German chancellor and the French president, that they said the same thing. It was a sham. And we're never going to implement Minsk. It was always designed to build the army. And then the United States built the military training facility in Western Ukraine in 2015, where every 55 days we trained a Ukrainian battalion to NATO standards to send them off to fight against the Russians in the Donbass. So now you're Vladimir Putin, and you're looking at this, you're saying they used diplomacy as a shield to build a military to violate the peace agreement that the Security Council of the United Nations said is manifest. Why would I ever negotiate with them again? And that's a question that every American, everybody listening to this, if you're in his shoes, why would you negotiate with anybody again? He had to go to the wives of the military men serving, some of them whose husbands had died in the war, and apologize. And he said, the greatest mistake I ever made was believing the West when they said they wanted peace. I had the Ukrainian army where I wanted them. I could have destroyed them. I could have ended this thing right then and there on terms favorable to us. But they said they wanted peace. They said they believed in peace, and I believed them. And for 8 years, sat back while the Ukrainians shelled. Remember, Petro Poroshenko, the same man who said it was a sham, he got on the air and broadcast that Ukrainian children will be able to go to kindergarten and walk in the parks and live a normal life. But the children of the Donbass will be cowering in their basements because of Ukrainian artillery fire. And he lived up to that promise for 8 years, killing hundreds of these children, thousands of civilians, and also, meanwhile, fighting that led to thousands of deaths on both sides in terms of combatants. It was a very bloody conflict perpetrated by the Ukrainians because they didn't want peace. So now Putin is sitting there saying, I learned my lesson. I will never make this mistake again. This war will end, but not by me falling yet again to the lies of the collective West, but by me dictating Russia's terms. And Russia's terms aren't unreasonable. Russia's terms are simply put, no more Nazis. And if anybody doesn't believe that what's going on in Ukraine is a resurrection of the neo-Nazi ideology of Adolf Hitler, just study Stepan Bandera, study the role the CIA played in promoting Bandera, encouraging Bandera. Talk about the war that took place, CIA secret war, using Bandera's forces from 1945 to 1953 in Ukraine. They killed 250,000 Russians, 50,000 Russian security forces, 150,000 Ukrainian insurgents. No American knows about this war. Talk about the 150,000 Ukrainian Banderas who fled to a diaspora, including here in the United States, 60 miles away from where I live. There's a monument to Stepan Bandera called Heroes Park, where his statue is there with 4 other Nazis. And every summer, Ukrainian Banderas, Americans, gather there and hold torchlight parades where children carry the imagery of Bandera and parade around singing praises to the slaughter of Jews, Poles, and Russians. That's what the government of Ukraine is today. So the Russians are saying denazification. That means they're going to get rid of Zelensky and replace that with a government will never again tolerate or glorify Stepan Bandera or his ideology. It also means the destruction of the Ukrainian army, which is happening as we speak through the Battle of Bakhmut. These are the objectives, and Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, ever. Now, what will be left of Ukraine? We know that they've permanently lost 20% of their territory. We know if this war continues, they'll probably lose 30% more because the Russians aren't, if the Russians capture Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov, they're never going to give it back. Those are Russian cities. They're never going to return them. The only way to avoid the loss of those territories is for Ukraine right now to surrender on Russia's terms. But that's not happening because NATO won't let them. So this war we fought to its inevitable conclusion, its tragic conclusion, and it means the death of the Ukrainian nation as we now know it. And that means tens of millions of Ukrainian civilians will be suffering for decades. And this is tragic. My heart breaks, but we're the ones responsible. We, the United States, we created this conflict. We are the ones that breathed life into the Minsk agreement, knowing it wouldn't ever be implemented. Remember, Putin met with Biden in Geneva in June of 2021. And part of that conversation, Putin said, please do everything you can to make Minsk happen. If you sign the Minsk Accords, if they sign it, they implement it, then there will be no problems. This whole thing goes away. And Biden promised him, send Tony Blinken to do this, and Blinken said, I'll do it, but he lied because we had no intention of implementing Minsk because we knew that Minsk was a sham designed to buy time to get lethal aid to the Ukrainians that we trained so they could attack the Donbass. We have not been honest brokers here, and we aren't honest brokers today. And frankly speaking, I don't want to get political here because this is a larger issue than politics, but the Biden administration can never be trusted by the Russians ever again. Ask yourself why there is no more strategic arms control between the United States and Russia. It's because the Biden administration can't be trusted, because they have negotiated in bad faith, because they have sought to gain strategic advantage, and the Russians are just tired of the game. Now, I would prefer the Russians don't take this hardline position. If I were advising Putin, I'd be advising a more moderate approach, but I understand if they say, we can't do that with Biden, we don't trust him, we can't trust him ever again. They lie to us. All they do is lie. And it's the truth. All America has done, all Europe has done, is lie to the Russians. So why would the Russians seek now to sit down at the table with people who have lied to them, whose strategic objective is the strategic defeat of Russia? Imagine for a second if Russia said, you know, we're going to go to Mexico and we're going to hold a coup d'etat and we're going to turn it over into a pro-Russian government, that then we're going to encourage this resurgence of Mexican nationalism, and we're going to work with them so they go across America's borders, work with the Hispanic American populations in the border states so that they rise up and we can strip those border states away from the United States so California becomes Mexico again. Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, all Mexico again. We're going to do this, and we're going to try and create the conditions in Washington, D.C., where the American people rise up and overthrow the constitutional elected government. What do you think the United States would do? We would say, hell no. We would go to war to prevent that, rightfully so. So if any American heard what I just said and says, I would never allow that to happen, then why are you allowing us to do that against the Russians? Is that not a double standard? Because that's what we're doing in Ukraine. We're stripping Ukraine away from the Russian orbit. We're trying to use Ukraine as a mechanism to destroy Russia, to overthrow their government. It's a double standard, ladies and gentlemen, and it has to stop, or else there will not be peace.